The doors of the Kansas City Federal Courthouse swung inward on a crisp spring morning, letting in a slip of cool air and the smell of rain left over from the night. The lobby's marble floor had been buffed to a quiet shine that caught the light from the high windows, and the security line moved with the slow civility of people who had done this dance many times before, belts into bins, laptops in trays, polite nods to the marshals. Angela Freeman held a worn manila folder to her chest like a hymn book. She had ironed her blouse before dawn, set a pot of coffee to keep warm, and told herself again that today would not break her. "Morning, Ms. Freeman," the older marshal at the magnetometer said, recognition softening his voice. He had learned her name over months of small talk, the way courthouse people do. "Good morning, Mr. Hines," Angela said. "How's your granddaughter?" "Learning to read me under the table," he chuckled, then looked at the folder. "Got your papers?" "I've got everything," she said. There was no drama in her tone, only a steady promise she kept making to herself. Up on the third floor, sunlight slanted through the tall panes and laid long rectangles across the hallway. A court clerk wheeled a cart stacked with files, the wheels whispering over the carpet. Angela knew the route by heart now, past the framed photographs of retired judges, past the vending machines that never seemed to carry the good crackers, past the bench under the big analog clock where people waited for names to be called. She paused by a small side table where a stainless steel carafe sat next to styrofoam cups and little packets of creamer. The courthouse coffee was never good, but it was warm and it occupied your hands. Angela poured half a cup, added 2 creamers, and stared at the swirl of brown and white until it settled into a color that reminded her of late afternoons on her grandmother's porch. She sipped, squared her shoulders, and walked toward chambers. Inside, Judge Evelyn Carter had been at her desk for an hour already, jacket draped neatly over the chair, sleeves rolled once at the wrist. She was the kind of woman who treated mornings kindly and expected them to do the same. A small brass desk lamp cast a pool of gold over a stack of pleadings, and the only sound was the steady scratch of a fountain pen moving across a legal pad. The judge's gavel sat slightly left of center, not as a threat or a trophy, but as a tool, a wooden reminder that order, like dignity, is something you set down carefully and pick up with respect. The petition lay open. In re Tyler Freeman, Petition for Writ of Habeas Corpus, 17 pages, not including exhibits. Judge Carter traced her finger down the first page as if counting stitches. The boy was 16, 8 months in county, awaiting a hearing on charges that never quite squared with the statutes cited. The arresting officer of record was Detective Mark Whitaker, a name the judge had seen more times in the last 2 years than she liked. She turned to Exhibit A, a photocopy of a mid-semester report card with teacher's notes written in blue ink. Consistent, respectful, great lab partner, shows leadership in group projects. Exhibit B was a letter from a coach who called Tyler a steady hand in the backfield and the kind of kid you trust with the ball in the fourth quarter. There was a photograph paper-clipped at the top right corner of the petition. Tyler and his older brother Daniel, standing in front of a school banner, both of them laughing in that loose-shouldered way boys do when the future looks wide open. The judge lifted her pen again, paused, tapped it twice against the pad, then wrote, "Initial review indicates probable deficiencies in probable cause narrative. Repeated references to pattern of behavior language without particularized facts." She underlined repeated, lightly. "Judge?" The knock was soft. Mara, her courtroom deputy, eased the door open. "Ms. Freeman's downstairs. She's early." "Of course she is," Judge Carter said. She closed the folder and set her hand on the gavel without thinking, a gentle touch, like resting your hand on someone's arm to say, "I'm listening." "Let's bring her into the conference room. Offer her some water." Mara smiled. "And a better coffee than the hallway kind?" "If there's mercy in this world," the judge said. "Yes." The conference room was not large. Just a table, 8 chairs, a credenza with a printer, and a rack of pens that always went missing. Through the window, the city's low skyline offered up brick warehouses and warehouse-turned lofts, the Missouri River, a silver suggestion beyond. Angela stood when the judge entered, then hesitated, unsure if she should speak first. "Ms. Freeman," Judge Carter said, reaching out, a habit she never quite gave up even in a world that preferred handshakes less. Angela took her hand, surprised by the warmth of it. "Thank you for seeing me," Angela said. "I'm glad you're here," the judge replied. "Please sit. I've begun reviewing the petition." Angela placed the folder on the table. The edges were soft from handling, the paper inside organized by careful tabs. School records, character letters, timeline, original notes. She slid out a single sheet and held it, but didn't push it forward yet. "Every morning," Angela said slowly, "I wake up and I have to remind myself to call him not at school, but at county. They say I can't visit some days because of staffing. They say a lot of things." Judge Carter nodded. "You've done a conscientious job preserving documents. That matters." Angela took that in. The compliment was modest, but it landed like a hand steadying a step. "I made copies of the copies just in case," she said, a small embarrassed laugh catching at the end. "That was wise," the judge replied. "Tell me about the day he was picked up." "It was a Tuesday. He leaves early when he has chemistry lab. I packed him a sandwich and a little note like I always do. Don't laugh." He rolls his eyes, but he reads them. The memory softened Angela's voice. "He texted me he was at the bus stop on time. That's the last normal thing I have." The judge wrote 2 words, "bus stop," on her pad. "And the officer's narrative?" "They said he was acting as a lookout for a gang initiation," Angela said, the word gang catching in her mouth, tasting like someone else had put it there. "They said he didn't have textbooks in his bag, which he did, because I put them there myself. They said a lot of things that don't fit." Judge Carter's eyes rested on Angela's face a moment longer than needed for note-taking. Not pity, not performance, attention. "We'll take it one piece at a time." When Angela left to speak with the clerk about the afternoon schedule, Mara closed the door and exhaled. "She makes me want to bake something." "Casseroles," Judge Carter said. "The original American procedural remedy." Mara smiled. "You think we're going to be okay this afternoon?" "We're going to be precise," the judge answered. She turned back to the legal pad. Under the first notes, she added, "Compare language to prior Whitaker affidavits. Check dates. Verify dispatch logs. Request data from civil rights." The pen paused again. She drew a small box around the word gavel, then put a dot in the corner of the box, a private way of telling herself to mind the symbols people lean on and the ones they throw. At 11, the judge returned to chambers and asked for the Whitaker file. The clerk wheeled in a gray bank box with a strip of blue painter's tape across the lid. "Whitaker. Misc. Reports." Inside, manila folders stood like fence posts. She lifted the first, then the second, scanning the arrest narratives. There it was, the vague skein of words that try to look like facts when they aren't. Subject observed, engaging in behavior consistent with. Known area for. Pattern aligned with. She read 3 reports, then 6, then 9. The sentences began to line up, not like echoes of a style, but like stencils. She sat back and let the silence deepen. The courthouse has a hush that isn't just sound. It's a posture. People carry themselves differently when the law is close. The judge glanced at the gavel, then out the window to where the river caught the light and slipped it along. Mara poked her head in. "Do you want lunch from Maggie's? They've got turkey on special." "Only if they promise not to call it artisan," the judge said, and Mara grinned and disappeared. On her next pass through the reports, Judge Carter narrowed the lens. She checked dates of claimed surveillance against school attendance records in the exhibits. On a day, Whitaker said Tyler frequently loitered in an area associated with recruitment. Tyler had signed for a chemistry lab makeup after a fire drill cut the period short. The timestamps left no room for both to be true. She circled the discrepancy and drew an arrow, then a second arrow, then wrote in the margin, "If pattern, where are the particulars?" She pushed the chair back and stood, stretching the stiffness from her neck. On the credenza, her phone vibrated with a message from an old colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Let me know if you need civil rights eyes on anything today." It was the sort of message you could dismiss as courtesy or receive as a door someone was willing to keep unlocked. When the afternoon calendar posted in the hallway, a few more people drifted toward 3B than usual. That happens sometimes. Word travels in a building like this without anyone meaning to. The bailiff checked the microphones. The court reporter set the ribbon. The flags hung at their respectful angles. Angela sat in the second row on the aisle. She had brought a cardigan because courts are always colder than you expect. She smoothed the ribbing at the cuff and watched the clerk slide water glasses into place. In the tiny pause before the session starts, there's a moment where everyone listens to their own breathing. That's when the door at the side opened and Judge Carter entered, straight-backed, chin level, the robe moving with her like a single, simple sentence. "All rise," the bailiff said, and the gallery stood. The judge nodded once, took her seat, and rested her hand on the gavel for a heartbeat. The sound of chairs returning to the floor went around the room like a soft wave. "Calling the matter of In re Tyler Freeman," the clerk announced. Angela folded her hands. She could feel her pulse in her finger joints. "Before we hear from counsel," Judge Carter said, "I have some questions regarding the circumstances of the arrest. Detective Whitaker is present?" He was. Mark Whitaker walked with the confident, territorial gait of a man comfortable in uniform, his service ribbons light bright across the chest. He nodded to the prosecutor as if closing an old conversation and took a seat at counsel table. When he lifted his chin to look at the bench, his eyes carried a practiced neutrality that had seen rooms like this as something to manage, not to respect. "Detective," Judge Carter said evenly, "the petition alleges Mr. Freeman has been detained without sufficient showing of probable cause. I've read your report. I want to clarify some factual statements you made." "Yes, Your Honor," he said. His Your Honor had that sanded edge some men give when respect is a coat they put on for the weather. "On the morning of the arrest, you state Mr. Freeman was observed engaging in behavior consistent with gang lookout activity near the corner of Truman and Prospect at 7:15 a.m. The judge glanced at her notes. "Is that correct?" "That's correct." "And your observation period lasted how long?" "Approximately 20 minutes. The judge set her finger on the line of the report. "Did you or your team document any exchanges, hand signals, verbal communications, or interactions with known members during that period?" Whitaker's jaw made a small movement. "These operations rely on trained pattern recognition, Your Honor. We don't always get textbook." "Thank you," Judge Carter said gently, a tone that closed one door and opened another. "My question is about what you observed, not what you inferred." "We observed him scanning the street," Whitaker said. "Nervous behavior." "That corner has a bus stop," the judge said. "Is that your recollection?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Does scanning the street while waiting for public transportation meet your department's definition of suspicious activity?" Whitaker's chair creaked, the smallest sound. "In context, yes." The judge kept her expression neutral. "I see." She turned a page. Angela let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and clasped the cardigan's cuff again. In the third row, a woman in a dark suit with a plain silver necklace took notes without looking up. Some faces in a courtroom are there every week. Others arrive when weather changes. "Detective," the judge said, "in your last 2 years of juvenile arrests, how many involved charges of activity consistent with as a primary basis?" "I don't have that number offhand." "We'll come back to it," Judge Carter replied, not unkindly. They walked through 3 more lines of the report, the judge's questions steady. Whitaker's answers precise in the way that leaves too much room around the edges. The prosecutor tried to offer a clarifying comment about community context, but Judge Carter thanked him and said she'd like to stick to the written record for the moment. On a side table, the court reporter paused to change a ribbon. It always fascinated Angela a little, how the official record was built, keystrokes catching words before they could dissolve. She thought of Tyler's letters from county, the way he wrote in tidy block print to make sure no one misread his U for an A. "Mom, please don't worry when you can't get through on Tuesdays. The phones are tricky then. I'm okay. Drink water. Tell Mrs. Chan I'll finish the chem packet when I'm out." She had folded that letter until the crease lines were almost silky. "Detective," Judge Carter said, "you've used an identical phrase in multiple affidavits, behavior consistent with recruitment methodologies. Do you maintain a template for your reports?" "No, Your Honor," he said quickly. "I just try to be thorough." "Thoroughness is commendable," she said. "Specificity is required." Her voice never rose, but something in its evenness quieted the room another degree. She looked down again at her legal pad, then up at the gallery, then back to Whitaker. "And you are aware Mr. Freeman's school attendance records place him on campus during times referenced in 2 of your earlier surveillance entries?" Whitaker blinked. Those times are approximate." "Of course," the judge said mildly. "We'll firm them up." A measure of time passed that was more felt than counted. The judge asked a few housekeeping questions: witness availability, whether dispatch logs could be produced by close of business, whether the county could accommodate a scheduled review of juvenile detention conditions the following week. Each answer found its place in the day like a puzzle piece settling into its right corner. Then Judge Carter closed the file gently and rested her fingertips on the gavel again. She glanced at the woman in the 3rd row, the one with the plain silver necklace, who looked back with the practiced calm of people who live inside investigations. The judge tipped her chin by a fraction. Acknowledgement, not instruction. When she spoke, her voice carried the warmth of a radio host who's about to say a hard thing kindly. "Ms. Freeman," she said, turning toward the 2nd row, "I've reviewed your exhibits. You've provided more than any parent should have to gather. Thank you." Angela managed, "Yes, Your Honor." But it was mostly air. Gratitude and fear live side by side some days. The judge reached for her phone and covered the bottom of the microphone, more habit than secrecy. Mara leaned in. "Judge?" "Connect me with the Civil Rights Division," Judge Carter said quietly, then set the phone down again and addressed the room. "We will recess for a short period and reconvene this afternoon." The bailiff called, "All rise," and the gallery stood. As the judge stepped off the bench, she paused, looked at the gavel, and aligned it square to the blotter, a small act of housekeeping that looked like reverence. She left by the side door, the robe's hem whispering against the carpet. In chambers again, the afternoon light had turned a deeper gold. On the credenza, the phone line clicked and chirped, then settled into a tone that said someone was on the other end, waiting. Judge Carter didn't sit. She'd always believed some conversations were better handled on your feet. "Evelyn Carter," she said, voice low. "Lauren Mitchell, Civil Rights," the woman on the line answered, her calm arriving through the wire like good posture. "We're tracking the docket." "I have a matter," the judge said. She looked out the window. The Missouri was brighter now, the sky washed clean. She touched the corner of the gavel box on her desk with the back of a knuckle, a habit close to prayer. "I'd like your office to review a set of arrest narratives that appear to share templated language, as well as dispatch logs and surveillance claims that may not align with school attendance records." Mitchell didn't fill the space with noise. "Understood. We will keep this within the bounds of propriety, Agent Mitchell," Judge Carter said. "But I'm not going to let this be a matter of context instead of facts." "I know your work," Mitchell said. "You don't do theater." The judge allowed herself the smallest smile. "No, I do order." Outside the conference room, Angela sat on the bench under the big clock. She watched a young lawyer in a slightly too large suit whisper jokes to a nervous client until the client laughed. She watched a janitor adjust a trash can so the lid sat right. little acts of care you barely notice unless you are trying to forget your fear. She closed her eyes and pictured Tyler's hands, the scab on the knuckle he always picked at during midterms, the way he spun a pencil during long waits. She thought about what to make for dinner if he came home: baked chicken, cornbread, green beans with a bit of onion. You could feed someone love without saying a word if you knew their favorites. Back in chambers, the judge hung up and stood very still, listening to the quiet like a musician, listening for the first note after the count-in. Then she dialed one more number, the clerk's desk. "Mara," she said, "please let the civil rights visitor sit in the back row without fuss. And bring Ms. Freeman a fresh cup of coffee. Not the hallway kind. The real stuff from Maggie's, cream on the side. Right away. Also," the judge added, almost as an afterthought, but not really, "would you check whether we still have the older gavel in storage? The one from the renovation? I'd like it on the bench this afternoon." "The older one?" Mara sounded amused. "Wood holds memory," Judge Carter said. "Sometimes a room needs to remember what it's for." When the phone clicked silent, she turned back to her legal pad, drew a line under her notes, and wrote in her calm, even hand, "Proceed with care. Proceed with courage. Proceed." She capped the pen, set it beside the pad parallel by instinct, and took a breath that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs. At 1:55 p.m., she walked the hallway toward 3B, the older gavel tucked under her arm in a cloth sleeve. As she reached for the door, she could see the silhouettes of people shifting into place beyond the frosted glass: Angela at the aisle, the woman with the silver necklace at the back, the prosecutor aligning his yellow pad, Whitaker leaning to say something to a colleague, a marshal adjusting the microphone. The judge found the rhythm of her footsteps and stepped through, letting the room rise to meet her. She placed the older gavel carefully on the bench. Wood on wood made a sound like a promise. "Court is in session," she said. And then, without ceremony and without hesitation, she picked up the phone on the corner of the bench, pressed a single button to connect the already open line, and spoke 12 words into the receiver that would bend the rest of the day. "Contact the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Tell them it's time." Detective Mark Whitaker didn't so much enter courtroom 3B as claim it. The double doors swung outward under his push, and he stepped inside with the measured gait of someone used to eyes following him. The Navy uniform was crisp, creases so sharp they could cut paper. The silver badge caught the light just enough to remind you it was there. Angela Freeman sat in the second row on the aisle, cardigan folded over her lap. She watched him without lowering her gaze. He didn't look at her, not directly. His eyes swept over the gallery the way a man might glance over property lines. Judge Evelyn Carter was already on the bench, robe falling in clean lines to the floor. She had the older gavel in place, its worn handle facing her right hand. Her expression didn't change as Whitaker approached the witness stand. The bailiff called for the court to come to order. Chairs scraped lightly as people sat. "Detective Whitaker," the clerk began, "you remain under oath from this morning's session." Whitaker nodded once, a small concession to formality. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. "Detective, we'll pick up where we left off. I have some follow-up questions about the language in your reports." Whitaker folded his hands loosely on the edge of the stand. "Yes, Your Honor. Earlier, you referred to behavior consistent with recruitment methodologies. Would you explain, in your own words, what that phrase means?" Whitaker's eyes shifted to the prosecutor, then back. "It refers to actions that, based on training and experience, suggest an individual is acting on behalf of a gang, keeping watch, signaling, things like that." "And in Mr. Freeman's case," Carter said evenly, "what actions did you personally observe that met that description?" "He was scanning the street repeatedly, nervous posture." "Anything else?" A pause. "That was sufficient for me, given the context of the location." Carter tapped the edge of the report with her index finger. "The corner of Truman and Prospect, where there is a public bus stop used by students and commuters?" Whitaker's jaw tightened. Yes, Your Honor. Angela's fingers pressed into the wool of her cardigan. She remembered that bus stop, its dented bench, the shelter with one pane of plexiglass missing. She'd stood there with Tyler on cold mornings when the wind came sharp off the river. From the back row, a woman in a plain navy suit sat very still, a notepad balanced on one knee. Special Agent Lauren Mitchell's pen moved in neat, spare strokes. She had chosen a seat where she could see both the bench and the witness without turning her head. Carter's next question came softly, almost conversationally. Detective, are you aware that in 23 of your juvenile arrest reports over the past 2 years, you used identical language to describe the suspect's behavior? Whitaker's gaze held steady. Patterns repeat in this line of work. Patterns can be useful, Carter said. They can also be misleading if applied without particular facts. Did you maintain a written template for these reports? No, Your Honor. I may have borrowed phrasing from earlier cases, but only when applicable. And who decides applicability? I do, based on my experience. The judge nodded slowly, letting the silence settle before she continued. Detective, do you keep contemporaneous notes during surveillance? Yes. I'd like to see them. They're in the case file, Whitaker said quickly. I'm referring to the original notes, not the finalized report. Whitaker's pause was shorter this time. I'd have to check. Carter turned to the prosecutor. Please see that those notes are provided to the court before close of business. Yes, Your Honor, the prosecutor said, pen already moving. Angela felt something shift. Not victory, but a small rebalancing of weight in the room. The kind you notice when a table leg that used to wobble suddenly holds steady. Mitchell's pen stilled. She looked toward Carter for just a fraction of a second, enough for someone who knew her to read approval there. The judge flipped to another page. One more question for now. On the date in question, Mr. Freeman's school records indicate he was on campus for a scheduled chemistry lab until approximately 7:25 a.m. How do you reconcile that with your statement that you observed him at Truman and Prospect at 7:15? Whitaker leaned forward slightly. The times in the report are approximate. 10 minutes is a short time in which to travel nearly 2 miles, Carter said, particularly during morning traffic. Would you agree? Whitaker didn't answer right away. It's possible my watch was off. Angela almost let out a short, humorless laugh, but pressed her lips together. She thought about Tyler's neat handwriting on the lab permission slip, the way he'd reminded her to initial it before she left for work that morning. Judge Carter looked toward the clerk. Mark this portion for review against the attendance record and transportation logs. Yes, Your Honor. Carter closed the file. We'll take a brief recess before calling the next witness. As people stood, Mitchell slipped her pen into her jacket pocket and stepped into the aisle, moving toward the corridor without drawing attention. Angela watched her go, curiosity pricking. She had the look of someone who saw more than she said. Whitaker stayed in the stand a moment longer than necessary, scanning the gallery. His gaze passed over Angela, unreadable. When the judge left the bench, the bailiff's voice filled the space. All rise. Angela rose with the rest, the cardigan slipping from her lap. She caught it before it hit the floor and held it close as if to keep the warmth in. Angela stepped out into the hallway with the others. The hum of conversation picked up as people stretched their legs, checked their phones, or headed toward the vending machines. Somewhere down the corridor, the hiss of an espresso machine from the small cafe stand mingled with the echo of heels on tile. She spotted Agent Mitchell near a window, speaking quietly to a man in a plain gray suit. They weren't looking her way, but Angela could tell from the tilt of Mitchell's head that the exchange mattered. There was no notebook now, just hands loosely clasped, a posture that said she was listening. Angela hesitated, then decided to keep walking. The last thing she wanted was to interrupt something important. Still, she felt a flicker of relief knowing someone else was paying attention. Back inside chambers, Judge Carter poured herself a half cup of coffee from the glass pot on the credenza. She added a splash of milk from the small refrigerator and stood at the window for a moment, looking down at the courthouse lawn. It was a habit she'd developed over years on the bench, stepping back from the words on the page to see the bigger picture, literally and figuratively. Mara entered with a thin folder. "Preliminary pull from county records," she said. "I asked for the original arrest notes, too. They claim they're in storage." "That was quick," Carter said. She set her coffee down and flipped through the first few pages. "Storage can wait. I want those notes by this evening." "They know you mean it?" Mara replied. "You want me to coordinate with civil rights?" Carter's eyes lifted briefly from the file. "Already in motion." The afternoon session drew a slightly larger audience. Word of an unusual line of questioning travels fast in a building where routines are rarely disrupted. Angela returned to her seat in the second row, this time noting that Mitchell had taken a spot at the very back, half in shadow from the window blinds. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Carter took her place, the older Gavel resting just to her right. "Detective Whitaker," she began, "before we proceed, I want to address the matter of your field notes." Whitaker, now standing beside the prosecutor's table, shifted his weight. "I'm told they're in storage at the precinct." "Then I expect them delivered here by end of day," Carter said, tone even but unyielding. "If they cannot be located, we'll note that on the record and draw appropriate conclusions." "Yes, Your Honor," Whitaker replied, though the stiffness in his voice betrayed something less than agreement. The prosecutor moved to call the next witness, but Carter raised a hand. "We'll hear them shortly. First, I want to confirm. Detective, have you ever been the subject of a departmental review regarding your arrest report language?" A pause, then, "Not formally, Your Honor." "Informally?" Whitaker's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Discussions happen in any department." Angela felt the tension ripple through the room. She didn't need to know the politics of a precinct to recognize when someone was avoiding daylight. Carter nodded once and let the question rest for now. "Proceed with your witness, counsel." As testimony moved on to routine procedural matters, Angela's attention drifted toward the back row. Mitchell was jotting something on a small card, then slipping it into the inside pocket of her jacket. The motion was casual but deliberate. When the court recessed again for the afternoon break, Mitchell didn't leave right away. She stayed seated until most of the gallery had filed out. Angela lingered by the aisle, pretending to adjust the strap on her handbag. Mitchell rose, smoothed her jacket, and as she passed Angela, spoke low enough for only her to hear. "You've done well keeping those records safe." Angela blinked. "You've seen them?" A small nod. "We'll talk soon." Then Mitchell was gone, stepping into the corridor with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she was headed. Angela sat back down for a moment, the hum of the emptying courtroom fading into the distance. She didn't know what soon meant in the world Mitchell came from, but it was the first time in months she felt like the truth had somewhere to go. The rain started just after lunch, tapping against the courthouse's tall windows in a rhythm that was both steady and restless. It made the wood paneling of Courtroom 3B glow a deeper shade, as if the walls had been polished in the pause between sessions. Angela sat at the same spot she had claimed since morning, cardigan over her shoulders now. She felt the day pressing forward, each recess like a slow turn of a wheel. Across the aisle, the prosecutor whispered something to Whitaker, who leaned back in his chair as though this were any other case on the docket. When Judge Carter returned to the bench, she carried a thin folder and a look that suggested the next hour would be memorable. The older Gavel was still at her right hand. She tapped it once, a quiet call to focus. "Before we proceed with additional witness testimony," Carter said, "this court will hear from Special Agent Lauren Mitchell of the FBI Civil Rights Division." The room shifted. Heads turned toward the back as Mitchell stood, straightening the lapels of her navy suit. She walked to the witness stand with the unhurried step of someone accustomed to the formality of federal court. The clerk administered the oath, and Mitchell's voice was calm as she affirmed. "Agent Mitchell," Carter began, You have brought certain materials to the court's attention? Yes, Your Honor. Mitchell opened a slim briefcase and withdrew a portable speaker and a labeled evidence envelope. These are excerpts from lawfully obtained recordings relevant to Mr. Freeman's arrest and to related cases under review. Whitaker's posture tightened. His hands, which had been loose on the table, now gripped the edge. Carter gestured toward the clerk's desk. Proceed. Mitchell placed the speaker on the evidence table, pressed a button, and after a faint click, a man's voice filled the courtroom. You just write it like the others. Behavior consistent with recruitment. Keep it clean so it sticks. These kids don't fight it, they don't know how. The gallery murmured, the sound low but unmistakable. Angela's breath caught. She recognized the tone, the casual authority. She glanced at Whitaker, whose jaw worked as if chewing words he couldn't swallow. The recording continued. A second voice, deeper, slower, responded. And the older one? Daniel Freeman? A pause, then the first voice again. Already handled. Don't bring his name up. Angela's fingers clenched the armrest. She had not expected to hear Daniel's name here, in this room, in that tone. Mitchell clicked the playback off. The first voice belongs to Detective Mark Whitaker. The second, based on corroborating evidence, is Lieutenant Greg Harlan of the North Division. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Carter's face remained composed. Agent Mitchell, is this recording part of a broader investigation? Yes, Your Honor. This is one of several pieces indicating coordinated misconduct involving multiple jurisdictions. Angela's mind raced. Multiple jurisdictions? She had thought this was about her son, about one arrest. Now it felt like the ground beneath her was larger and perhaps more dangerous than she had realized. Carter leaned back slightly, eyes on Whitaker. Detective, do you dispute the authenticity of this recording? Whitaker's lips parted, then closed. I'd like to consult with counsel before responding. You'll have that opportunity, Carter said evenly. Mitchell set the speaker aside and produced a short transcript. We have additional recordings, but given the nature of the investigation, we're limiting playback to excerpts directly relevant to Mr. Freeman's case at this time. Carter accepted the transcript, flipped through the first page, and then returned her attention to the room. This court will recess briefly to review these materials in chambers. The bailiff's voice rang out, All rise! As the judge left the bench, Angela's eyes followed her, but her thoughts were on Mitchell. The agent had kept her word. We'll talk soon had turned into action faster than Angela expected. In the hallway, Mitchell passed by without stopping, but as she turned the corner, she spoke just loud enough for Angela to hear. This is just the beginning. The hallway outside 3B felt different with the rain on the windows. Voices softened, footsteps less certain. Word had spread, the way it does in federal buildings without anyone writing it down. By the time court reconvened, the benches were a little fuller. 2 high school teachers on their lunch break, a church deacon with his hat in his lap, a neighbor Angela recognized from the block who gave her a small nod of solidarity. People who didn't normally sit through hearings sat through this one. Inside chambers, Judge Carter read the transcript with the patience of someone who knows haste can ruin careful work. She traced each line with a finger, checked timestamps, and marked the margins with brief notes that looked almost like musical rests, short, quiet signs that told her when to pause, when to press. She asked Mara for the dispatch summaries and school attendance confirmations again, not because she doubted them, but because repetition is how you stand something up so it doesn't fall over later. When Carter returned to the bench, she brought only the transcript and her legal pad. She did not look at Whitaker first. She looked at the gallery, at Angela, at the deacon with his hat, at the teachers who had chosen to spend their break here instead of in the comfort of a staff room. Then she looked at the witness stand. Agent Mitchell, she said, the court will hear a second excerpt limited to the period surrounding the detention of Mr. Freeman. Mitchell rose, shoulders squared, but not rigid. "Yes, Your Honor." She set the speaker back on the table and pressed play. The recording was noisier this time. The clink of glass, a TV murmuring someplace. The same voice as before, the one Mitchell had attributed to Whitaker, came through cleaner after a few seconds. "Kid's got grades," the voice said, half a laugh in it. "Makes him useful. If he throws a fit, we call it attitude. If he keeps quiet, we call it suspicious. Either way, he stays where I need him." A different voice, not Harlan, cut in. "You want me to move the timestamp?" "Make it match the street camera on Prospect," the first voice replied. "No one's checking the bus feed." Mitchell stopped the clip. The silence that followed wasn't shock, not exactly. It was something more focused, as if the room were taking a single deep breath. Angela's grip tightened. She thought about the bus feed, how she had called the transit office twice and been told footage wasn't stored that long unless a request came within a certain window. She had printed the emails and folded them into the manila folder anyway. There are things you save even when you're told they won't matter. Sometimes they matter later. "Agent Mitchell," Carter said, "what is the provenance of this recording?" "It was obtained pursuant to a court order in a separate matter, Your Honor," Mitchell answered. "Cross-referenced here because of the statements regarding Mr. Freeman." "Is the speaker identified as Detective Whitaker?" Carter asked. "Yes, Your Honor. Voice analysis and corroborating messages from the same date support that identification." Whitaker's attorney shifted in his chair. "Your Honor, we object to the characterization." "Your objection is noted," Carter said. "The court is fully capable of distinguishing characterization from evidence." A woman in the back sniffed. The deacon adjusted his hat on his knees. One of the teachers leaned slightly toward the other, as if to hold balance. Angela felt a small, surprising steadiness rise in her chest. It wasn't triumph. It was the sense that the floor under her feet had been reinforced. The prosecutor stood and attempted to change the subject to routine chain of custody matters. Carter allowed a few questions, then turned back to Mitchell. "Agent, without compromising your investigation, can you explain the scope of what you are looking at?" Mitchell measured her words. "We are examining patterns in arrest reports and incident narratives across several departments. We're also comparing those narratives to objective records, school attendance, transit data, emergency dispatch. Where words and facts don't line up, we look harder." Carter nodded. "And in this case?" "In this case," Mitchell said, "the words and the facts are not aligned." Angela closed her eyes for a moment. It was a simple sentence, but it felt like someone had set a lantern down in a dark hallway. The judge turned slightly toward Whitaker. "Detective, has your department made any formal requests for video from the transit authority related to the date in question?" Whitaker's jaw tensed. "I'd have to check with records." "Please do so," Carter said. "We'll have the clerk contact transit directly as well. If footage exists, it will be preserved." "Yes, Your Honor." Mara made a note to herself in big block letters. Preserve. She circled it twice. Outside, the rain quickened for a minute, then eased, like a conversation finding its rhythm. Inside, the court moved through more testimony. Dispatch logs, a custody sergeant describing intake, a school registrar quietly confirming timestamps. None of it had heat, it had weight. During a short recess, Angela stood by the window with her styrofoam cup, now filled with water instead of coffee. The teachers had to leave for afternoon classes, but one pressed a folded note into Angela's hand. A list of parents willing to write letters and the name of a guidance counselor who had already offered to testify. "I taught Daniel," the teacher said, voice soft. "He helped my 9th graders with their math on his free period. He didn't broadcast it, he just showed up." Angela nodded, unable to answer for a second. Back in chambers, Carter reviewed a short email chain Mara had pulled. An internal note from a precinct admin 2 days after Tyler's arrest asking, "Anyone request KC transit footage?" And a reply, "No need, we've got enough." It wasn't proof of anything alone. But like most things in law, it didn't stand alone. It stood beside other facts, and together they said more than any one of them could say alone. When the judge returned to the bench again, it was near 4. The light through the windows had shifted to that late afternoon tone that makes wood look warmer and faces look more honest. Carter rested her hand near the older gavel without touching it. "This court recognizes," she said, "that today's record raises questions larger than a single arrest. We will address the petition before us with the seriousness it deserves. We will also ensure that any broader concerns are referred to the appropriate authorities." She looked at Angela when she said it, not because Angela needed comfort, but because dignity deserves witness. Whitaker sat rigid in his chair, the set of his shoulders suggesting someone fighting a tide he couldn't name. For a brief second he turned his head and his eyes met Angela's. No message passed between them. Some distances can't be crossed by looking. Carter called on Mitchell once more. "Agent, you indicated earlier that additional recordings exist. Is there one more excerpt you can play that is directly relevant to the credibility of the arrest narrative in this case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mitchell said. She pressed the button. This clip was short. A door shutting, voices lower, the scrape of a chair. Whitaker again. "Make sure the statement says, 'reached toward waistband.'" That language holds. The clip ended. The court reporter's fingers hovered a moment over the keys, then resumed. "Detective," Carter said, "did Mr. Freeman reach toward his waistband during your observation?" Whitaker's mouth opened. "No, Your Honor. That language refers to general officer safety concerns. It's standard." "Standard," Carter repeated, not with sarcasm, but with the kind of plainness that puts a word under better light. "Thank you." The deacon in the back nodded once to himself, as if silently agreeing with a sermon point that didn't need shouting. Counsel for Whitaker rose again. "Your Honor, with respect, the agent's presentation lacks full context and risks prejudicing these proceedings." Carter inclined her head. "Context will be fully developed. For today, the court is concerned with whether there exists a credible basis for the detention of a 16-year-old child. On that question, this evidence is highly relevant." Angela let the phrase 16-year-old child wash over her. People had been calling Tyler defendant for months. Hearing the part of him that came before and after the case name, that mattered. A marshal approached the bench and handed Mara a note. She passed it to the judge. Carter read it, then addressed the room. "The county confirms Mr. Freeman is available for an in-person review tomorrow morning if necessary. Counsel will confer with the court regarding logistics." Angela's knees went a little soft. "Tomorrow." She mouthed a thank you she couldn't say out loud. Carter set the note aside. "Agent Mitchell," she said, "one final question for today. Without revealing sensitive strategy, do you anticipate that your work will extend beyond this city?" Mitchell looked from the bench to the gallery and back, aware that each word now would carry farther than the 4 walls. "Yes, Your Honor," she said simply. "We are seeing mirrored language and practices in nearby jurisdictions. We will follow the facts." The judge nodded once. "Very well." She glanced at the older gavel, then at the clock. "We will recess for the day," Carter announced, "and reconvene at 9:00 a.m. Counsel, please remain for a brief scheduling conference." "All rise," the bailiff called. People stood. The deacon put his hat on. The teacher's empty space on the bench made a neat rectangle. Whitaker remained seated, a beat too long, then stood as if the floor had shifted under him and he needed to steady himself. Angela gathered her things slowly and turned to go, careful with the note in her hand from the teacher. When she reached the aisle, Mitchell was there. Not close, not intrusive, just present. "I'll walk you to the elevator," Mitchell said. They moved down the hall, past the photographs of judges from decades ago, past the vending machines and the analog clock with its reliable tick. Angela pressed the elevator button and looked at the agent. "I've been holding this folder like it could keep my son safe," she said quietly. "Some days it felt foolish." "It wasn't foolish," Mitchell replied. "You kept the pieces that let the truth lock together." The elevator dinged. They stepped inside. Mitchell reached out and briefly touched Angela's forearm, a gesture as small as a comma. "Get some rest if you can," she said. "Tomorrow will be full." Angela nodded. "You too." On the sidewalk outside, the rain had eased to a mist. Cars hissed by on wet pavement, and somewhere a siren wailed and then faded. The city carried on, indifferent and attentive all at once. Back upstairs, Judge Carter remained on the bench while counsel argued calendar points and document delivery times. She listened, made 2 or 3 precise rulings, and then stood. When the room finally emptied except for Mara, she reached for the older gavel and weighed it in her hand. The wood was smooth where many hands had lifted it, tiny dents along the head like a history you can feel more than see. Mara waited by the doorway. "You want me to order dinner in, Judge? You're not leaving soon, are you?" "I'll leave by 7, Carter said. "Go home before the storm starts again." Mara smiled. "It never really stops here." "No," Carter agreed, setting the gavel down with care. "It just changes rooms." She looked once more over the empty benches, at the places where the day had sat, the second-row aisle seat, the back-row shadowed corner, the witness stand that had finally done what it was built for. She turned off the bench light and felt the room exhale. As the last few people filtered into the corridor, someone had propped open the doors of 3B with a folded blue file so the stale air could drift out and the cool evening air could drift in. Angela stood a moment at the threshold, listening to the rain begin again. Light, persistent, tapping out a time she could walk to. Behind her, in the courtroom that would hold tomorrow's continuation, the older gavel rested on the bench like a promise kept. And in that quiet, as marshals checked locks and the janitor pushed his cart past, Special Agent Lauren Mitchell stepped forward the next morning, rose when the clerk called her name, and said clearly for the record what the day had been building toward. "Your Honor, this is just the beginning. We have reason to believe this is part of a multi-state conspiracy." The next morning, Courtroom 3B felt like it was breathing before anyone said a word. There was a different kind of weight in the air, less the heaviness of waiting, more the pull of something gathering speed. Angela arrived early, the manila folder clutched to her chest. She'd barely slept, replaying Mitchell's words from the night before, multi-state conspiracy. That was the kind of phrase you heard on the evening news, not in the same breath as your child's name. The benches filled faster than usual. Not just neighbors and teachers now. There were reporters in the back, their notepads resting on their knees, pens ready, but quiet. 2 men in dark suits Angela didn't recognize took seats near the aisle, each with the watchfulness of people trained to see more than they say. At 9 o'clock sharp, Judge Carter entered. She didn't linger with her opening remarks. "We will continue with testimony from the Civil Rights Division. Special Agent Mitchell, please take the stand." Mitchell walked forward, her navy suit pressed and her expression as calm as yesterday. She carried a thicker file this time. The clerk swore her in again, and Carter wasted no time. "Agent Mitchell, you testified yesterday regarding recordings implicating Detective Whitaker and others in coordinated misconduct. Has your investigation advanced since then?" "Yes, Your Honor. Overnight, our team cross-referenced arrest language from this jurisdiction with reports from 3 neighboring states. We have identified 27 cases in which nearly identical wording was used to justify juvenile detentions." Angela felt her pulse in her fingertips. 27. And that was just what they'd found overnight. Carter's brow lifted slightly. "Do these cases share any other characteristics?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mitchell said. "Most involve minority youth, many with no prior record. In several, the objective evidence, such as school attendance logs or transit footage, contradicts the arrest narratives." Whitaker shifted in his seat. His attorney leaned in, whispering, but Whitaker kept his eyes on the table in front of him. Mitchell continued, "We've also uncovered internal communications between certain officers and out-of-state counterparts. These exchanges reference keeping the language tight and aligning statements for consistency." The prosecutor rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This strays into speculative territory." "It will be tied to evidentiary exhibits," Mitchell replied evenly. Carter held up a hand. "Overruled for now. Continue, Agent." From the second row, Angela watched Mitchell place a set of printed pages on the evidence table. The font was small, the lines dense, but even from a distance, Angela could see the repeated phrases. Like someone had copied and pasted whole sentences across different cases, just swapping names and dates. "This," Mitchell said, tapping the top page, "is why the patterns matter. Words aren't just descriptions here. They're tools. Used together, across borders, they can create an appearance of legitimacy that shields misconduct." The gallery was silent. The rain that had started before dawn pattered softly against the windows, a quiet counterpoint to the sharp edges of the testimony. Carter leaned forward slightly. "Agent Mitchell, are you prepared to say whether these actions appear to be coordinated?" Mitchell met her gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. Based on the evidence, we believe this is a coordinated practice involving multiple officers across at least 4 states." The prosecutor stood again, voice tighter this time. "Your Honor, I must object to this characterization. There's been no cross-examination on these new claims. And you will have that opportunity," Carter said, her tone holding steady. "For now, the court will hear the outline of the investigation." Angela's mind was spinning. She thought of the other parents, faces she didn't know, stories she couldn't yet picture, whose children's names might be hidden in those 27 cases. Mitchell went on to describe a chain of emails from 2 years ago between Whitaker and an officer in another state, discussing streamlining language for efficiency. One email included a sample paragraph almost identical to the one used in Tyler's report. From the back row, one of the men in the dark suits, Angela guessed FBI or Justice Department, leaned forward slightly, listening without taking notes. Carter flipped through the printed exhibits, then set them aside. "Agent Mitchell, what are your next steps?" "We will be seeking federal warrants, Your Honor. Some targets are outside this jurisdiction, and coordination with U.S. attorneys in other districts will be necessary. Given the scope, arrests could take place within days." A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Whitaker's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Angela's breath came slow and measured, like she was trying not to wake something sleeping inside her. Arrests within days. That meant they were moving. That meant Tyler might not be forgotten in the slow churn of the system. The prosecutor began cross-examining Mitchell, focusing on procedural points, chain of custody, authentication of recordings, the timing of transcript preparation. Mitchell answered each question with calm precision, never raising her voice. When the cross-examination ended, Carter made a brief note on her pad, then addressed the courtroom. "We will recess for 30 minutes before hearing from the defense. Counsel, please confer with your clients. Agent Mitchell, remain available to the court." The bailiff called the recess. People stood, talking in low tones. The reporters in the back scribbled notes, some already heading for the hallway to call their editors. Angela stayed seated for a moment. She could feel the shift, like the case was no longer just about surviving the day, but about seeing where the trail led. Whitaker remained at the defense table, speaking quietly to his attorney. His shoulders were stiff, but there was a twitch in his jaw that hadn't been there yesterday. In the hallway, Angela found herself beside Mitchell again. "You're going to arrest him, aren't you?" Angela asked quietly. Mitchell didn't break stride. "It's not just about him. This is bigger." Angela hesitated. "Does bigger mean safer for Tyler?" Mitchell's answer was steady. "It means more eyes on the truth, and that's never a bad thing." Back inside, when court resumed, the defense tried to paint the recordings as out-of-context conversations and the email chains as professional shorthand. But the words didn't sound as solid when the gallery had already heard the recordings for themselves. Carter allowed both sides their arguments, then closed her notebook with a quiet finality. "This hearing will continue tomorrow morning at 9. In the meantime, This court directs that all original field notes, electronic communications, and related records be preserved and produced without delay. Failure to comply will result in sanctions." She paused, letting the words settle. Additionally, given the federal interest in this matter, the court invites Agent Mitchell to coordinate directly with the clerk regarding any warrants or subpoenas that intersect with these proceedings. The bailiff called for adjournment. As people filed out, Whitaker walked briskly toward the side exit, his attorney close behind. The men in dark suits followed at a distance, not hurried, not slow. Angela stepped into the hallway, the manila folder still under her arm. Mitchell was talking quietly with one of the suited men, her expression unreadable. When she saw Angela, she gave a small nod. Not a signal, just acknowledgement. Angela didn't need words. She could feel it. Something was moving now, and the next time she stepped into this courtroom, it might be to watch the first piece of the whole thing come down. The rain had wrung itself out overnight and left the city scrubbed and bright. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse windows held a pale, steady light, the kind that makes everything look a little more honest. Courtroom 3B filled early, neighbors again, a youth pastor this time, a retired teacher with a canvas tote, a few reporters trying to look like regular citizens. Angela took her usual place on the aisle, palms flat on the manila folder to keep them from fidgeting. She had tucked a church bulletin in there that morning, the corner peeking out like a bookmark. Judge Evelyn Carter stepped onto the bench at 2 on the dot. She placed the older gavel just where she liked it, head angled slightly toward her legal pad, handle within reach. The bailiff's call quieted the room, and for a moment the air felt organized, as if order itself had taken a seat with the rest of them. "Good afternoon," Carter said. "We will resume with matters related to In re Tyler Freeman and the pending evidentiary questions." Detective Mark Whitaker sat at counsel table with his attorney. The uniform had been replaced by a dark suit and a tie that looked chosen to disappear against the shirt. His posture was straighter than usual, shoulders back, chin level, as if good geometry could rescue a bad day. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not look at the back row where Special Agent Lauren Mitchell sat, a slim folder on her lap, a plain silver pen tucked behind one ear. "Before we proceed to additional witnesses," Carter said, "the court notes that certain field notes and communications were to be produced by close of business yesterday." She glanced at the clerk. Mara stood. "Your Honor, we have received partial production from the precinct. 7 pages of notes, 1 redacted email chain, and a declaration that additional materials are unavailable at this time due to storage retrieval delays." Carter's eyebrow moved the slightest bit. "Detective Whitaker, is that your understanding?" Whitaker leaned to his attorney, then rose. "Yes, Your Honor. The Records Department is working to locate any remaining materials." "Very well," Carter said. "The court will take up the failure to produce if necessary. For now, we will address the contents we do have." She nodded to the clerk, who brought the thin stack forward. The judge flipped the pages, stopping at the 3rd, where a narrow column of block letters marched down the right margin. Even from the gallery, Angela could see a phrase boxed in pencil, "behavior consistent with." The handwriting repeated the phrase 3 times, the boxes neat and identical, like a teacher's sample on a chalkboard. "Detective," Carter said without looking up, "are these your handwritten notes?" Whitaker stayed standing. "Yes, Your Honor." "And this boxed phrase, behavior consistent with, is this your standard language?" "It's common language in our department," Whitaker said. "It's accurate." "Accurate to what?" Carter asked, finally raising her eyes. "To the patterns we observe," he said carefully. Carter studied him for a beat, then set the paper aside. "Agent Mitchell." Mitchell rose, unhurried. "Yes, Your Honor." "Please approach with Exhibit 14. Mitchell carried her folder to the evidence table, where she set down a simple chart. 2 columns of dates, locations, subjects. The left column was the department's, the right column was the transit authority's data. Bus arrivals and departures, camera timestamps. Lines connected the entries like little bridges. Some of those lines lined up. Several did not. "Agent," Carter said, "walk us through the discrepancies relevant to Mr. Freeman." Mitchell did, her voice steady, never theatrical. On the morning cited in Whitaker's report, the bus at Truman and Prospect had arrived at 7:12 and departed at 7:14. The next bus came at 7:28. The transit camera showed a handful of students with backpacks, a man in a Royals cap, a woman with a stroller, no Tyler. The school camera at the chemical lab wing, however, captured Tyler badge in at 7:18, then badge out again at 7:26 after the drill. The prosecutor tried to dull the edges, clock drift, camera angles, and Mitchell acknowledged the caveats without ceding the point. The lines didn't cross where the words said they did. Carter let the record fill quietly. She thanked Mitchell, then signaled for the clerk to collect the chart. When she spoke, her voice had that radio warmth that could hold a room without pressing on it. "Counsel," she said to Whitaker's attorney, "you may question your client." The defense opted to keep Whitaker at the table and let the attorney speak for him. It was tactical, sensible on most days. Today, it had the feel of someone whispering directions to a driver who'd already missed the exit. "Detective Whitaker's experience spans 15 years, the attorney began. "He has served this city with distinction and—" "Detective," Carter said gently, cutting through the preface with a clean line. "I'd like to hear directly from you on one point. Did you personally request the transit footage for the date at issue?" The attorney hesitated. Whitaker looked up. "No, Your Honor," he said. "Did you ask anyone in your department to request it?" Silence flashed across Whitaker's face like a gull crossing a bright sky. "No, Your Honor." "Thank you," Carter replied, as if he had done her a small favor. The defense shifted to a familiar footing. Emphasize discretion, invoke officer safety, remind the room that police work is hard. All of that can be true, and some days it matters. But today, in this courtroom with this record, the words sounded like they'd been stored too long in a warm closet. When the attorney sat, Carter looked toward the back row. "Agent Mitchell," she said, "the court will hear the next excerpt." Mitchell set a small speaker on the evidence table and pressed play. The clip was short, the scrape of a chair in what sounded like a break room, then Whitaker's voice, easy and offhand. "Make sure the statement says reached toward waistband." That language holds. The clip ended. No one spoke for a moment. The court reporter shifted in her chair and looked down at the keys like they were a quilt she'd been sewing all afternoon. "Detective," Carter said softly, "did Mr. Freeman reach toward his waistband on the morning of his arrest?" "No, Your Honor," Whitaker said. The words came out flatter than he intended. "It's a standard phrase to indicate—" "Indicate what?" Carter's voice stayed calm. "Officer safety concerns," he said. "Thank you," Carter replied. Angela heard a small sound behind her, like someone setting a teacup in a saucer. It might have been the retired teacher. It might have been her own heartbeat finally finding a slower measure. The prosecutor stood to ask a question about trained pattern recognition, and Carter let him go one more round. Mitchell sat, hands folded, expression open and unreadable at the same time. The men in dark suits along the aisle watched without blinking. Whitaker rubbed his thumb across the edge of the table as if there were a nick there. Perhaps there was. Wood keeps score. Carter glanced at the clock. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," she announced. "Counsel, approach for scheduling on production issues." "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood. Whitaker remained seated one heartbeat longer than the rest, then pushed back his chair. He looked toward the bench, then toward the back row. His gaze snagged on Angela for the briefest second. She met it without flinching. Then the moment was gone. In the hallway, the afternoon had the brightness that follows rain. A strip of sun fell across the tile like a welcome mat. Angela walked to the small cafe stand and bought a bottle of water she didn't really want. Mitchell appeared at her side as if they'd planned it. "You're holding up," the agent said simply. "I'm holding on," Angela answered. Mitchell's mouth tilted. Not quite a smile. "That counts." Is "Is this almost over?" Angela asked. Mitchell looked out the window, where a delivery truck eased up to the curb. "This part is almost at a turn," she said. "That's different from over, but it's important." They went back in together, 3 steps apart. When court reconvened, the gallery settled in more tightly, as if everyone knew the next stretch would be the one they would tell other people about later. Carter took the bench and rested her fingertips lightly on the older gavel, not to use it, but to feel the wood. The bailiff called the room to order. "Before we proceed," Carter said, "the court notes that production of original field notes is incomplete. The precinct is ordered to continue retrieval. Agent Mitchell, coordinate with the clerk to ensure preservation. Detective Whitaker, you are reminded that spoliation carries consequences." Whitaker's attorney started to reply, then thought better of it. "Very well," Carter said. "Agent Mitchell, if you would—" "Your Honor." Whitaker's voice cut across hers, sharp, unsmoothed. He stood without waiting for counsel, the chair legs squealing against the floor. The sound was too loud for the quiet room, and it broke the surface of the calm like a skipped stone. Carter didn't raise her voice. "Detective, you will address the court through counsel." "With respect," he said, and there was no respect in it. "I'm not going to sit here while my work is dragged through the mud by people who don't understand the neighborhoods I've had to—" "Detective," Carter repeated, level. "Sit down." He didn't. He took a step toward the lectern. The bailiff shifted his stance. One of the men in dark suits along the aisle turned his head a fraction. Whitaker's attorney tugged at his sleeve. "Mark," he said under his breath. "Don't." Whitaker ignored him. "You call this due process?" he said louder now. "You take a phrase out of a dozen reports and pretend you've solved something. You think you can run a city from a bench with a—" He reached the lectern and put both hands on it. The wood shivered the way wood does when someone treats it like a wall. For a long heartbeat, he didn't say anything. The room went very still. Outside the windows, a cloud slid across the sun and made the light less kind. Then Whitaker moved. It wasn't a lunge. It wasn't a rush. It was a simple, thoughtless reach, the way habit lives in your muscles. He reached toward the bench, toward the little stand to the judge's right, toward the symbol that had sat in the corner of his eye all afternoon, like a dare. His fingers brushed the handle of the gavel. "Detective," Carter said, and this time there was steel under the velvet. The nearest marshal was already in motion, a clean, practiced step that carried him between the bench and the lectern, his palm up in a stop that didn't need words. Another marshal came up on Whitaker's other side. The gavel stayed where it was. Carter had not flinched. She had not reached for it either. The room seemed to inhale and hold. Whitaker's hand hovered in the air a second too long. Then he let it fall. "Step back, sir," the marshal said, voice calm enough to cool tea. Whitaker stepped back. His breathing was visible in his throat. He tried to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. It looked like a photograph taken a half-second too late to catch the expression he wanted. Carter lifted the gavel, not to strike it, but to move it farther from the edge, a tidy person's reflex. She set it down gently, the sound as small as a button. "This is a court of law," she said. "We resolve disputes with facts and with respect. There will be no more breaches of decorum." For a moment, the room felt like a church just after the choir has finished, quiet but not empty. Angela stood without meaning to, then realized everyone else was still seated and sank back down. Mitchell's hands were folded again, but her shoulders were no longer relaxed. Somewhere behind the bar, the court reporter blew out a careful breath she didn't realize she'd been keeping. "Agent Mitchell," Carter said, picking up her legal pad, "you may proceed." "Yes, Your Honor." Mitchell stepped to the evidence table with a final document. "For the record, we have secured judicial authorization regarding certain electronic communications. Based on today's testimony and the materials submitted, those authorizations have matured into active warrants." Us. The doors at the rear of the courtroom opened a fraction, quiet, not dramatic. 2 additional marshals entered and took positions by the side aisles. The men in dark suits adjusted their jackets, a choreography so ordinary it might have meant nothing. But it meant something. Whitaker's attorney half rose, then sat again. Whitaker didn't move. The color had drained from his face in a way that made him look unfamiliar, like a cousin you hadn't seen since childhood. Mitchell continued, voice even. These warrants pertain to individuals and facilities in multiple jurisdictions. Coordination is underway with federal partners as we speak. Carter looked from Mitchell to counsel, then to the gallery. This court will take a brief recess to allow the marshals to manage logistics, she said. When we return, we will address scheduling for the petition. Counsel are reminded to remain available. Ms. Freeman, she met Angela's eyes. Please see the clerk before you leave today. Angela nodded, a quick, involuntary motion that felt like gratitude and readiness at the same time. All rise, the bailiff called. People stood. The benches creaked. Whitaker reached for his chair and then let his hand hover above it. He seemed surprised to find nothing solid under his palm. As Carter stepped down from the bench, Mitchell turned toward the back of the room and gave the smallest nod. The door opened wider. The two men in dark suits, whom Angela now understood were more than observers, stepped through and disappeared into the hallway, their pace unhurried and purposeful. In the corridor, word traveled without words. A deputy moved toward the service elevator. A clerk left her desk and closed a door with uncommon gentleness. A marshal spoke into his sleeve in a voice low enough to be mistaken for a cough. The air had the feel of a summer storm an hour before it breaks. You can't see the rain yet, but the leaves know. Angela stood by the window for a moment and looked down at the street. The light had sharpened again. People came and went with their paper bags and briefcases and umbrellas they wouldn't need. She pressed her palm lightly to the glass, not for luck, but to remind herself that something real stood between her and the drop to the sidewalk. Mitchell appeared at her elbow. Ms. Freeman, she said, the clerk has some scheduling information for you. Is he... Angela began, then stopped. Do I ask that? You don't have to, Mitchell said kindly. Today's about setting the table. Supper's still to come. Angela almost laughed, surprised by the homely wisdom of it. My mother used to say that, she murmured. Set the table right, and folks will eat in peace. Smart woman, Mitchell said. They walked back in. When the court reconvened, Carter's voice carried the same warmth it had at the start, but there was an undertone now, like harmony under melody. This court will issue its ruling on the petition's preliminary matters tomorrow morning, she said. In the meantime, all parties are directed to comply fully with preservation and production orders. Any further failure will be addressed with appropriate sanctions. She paused, then looked directly at Whitaker. The law belongs to everyone in this room. So does the order that protects it. The attorney for Whitaker stood, started to say something, then sat again. The words must have sounded different in his head than they would have sounded in the air. Carter lifted the older gavel and brought it down once. The sound was not loud. It didn't need to be. This session is in recess, she said. All rise. The benches shifted, shoes scuffed, people exhaled. On the far side of the rail, a marshal stepped toward Whitaker. Not fast, not slow. Whitaker's eyes flicked to the back, to the side doors, to the bench. He swallowed. For a second, his hand lifted toward his chest like he was checking for a badge that wasn't there. Mitchell closed her folder, placed the silver pen inside, and stood. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady and plain. Based on today's record, the federal warrants are now active. The doors at the back opened fully. Footsteps approached, measured, professional. Somewhere down the hall, another set of doors opened, and then another. The sound traveled toward them like a promise being kept. The sun was already warm over Kansas City when Angela pulled into the courthouse parking lot for what she hoped would be the last time. She paused with her hand still on the steering wheel, letting the hum of the engine fade before turning the key. Today felt different. Not the jittery anticipation of testimony or the cold weight of new evidence, but something steadier, like a long-held breath finally being let go. Inside, Courtroom 3B was nearly full, but the mood had shifted. The benches that once held only tight faces and guarded eyes now carried the easy murmur of neighbors greeting each other, a church friend passing along a wrapped muffin, even a couple of reporters smiling at a shared joke. The air felt less like a battleground and more like a front porch on a sunny Sunday. Angela spotted Tyler at the far side of the gallery, seated between a youth counselor and one of the marshals. He looked older somehow, still just 17, but with a steadiness in his posture that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. When he caught his mother's eye, he gave a small nod, almost formal, but his mouth curved just enough to let her know he was glad she was there. Judge Carter entered, her black robe flowing easily as she took the bench. She set the old gavel in its place, fingertips resting on it for a moment, as if acknowledging the weight it had carried. "Good morning," she said, and it sounded warmer than it ever had. The clerk read the docket. In re Tyler Freeman, motion to dismiss with prejudice. Carter's gaze moved to the prosecutor. "The state?" The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented and upon consultation with federal authorities, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Freeman with prejudice." A ripple of sound ran through the room, not the gasp of surprise from earlier days, but a quiet sigh, as if the whole gallery had been holding one breath together. Carter turned to Tyler. "Mr. Freeman, you are free to go. These charges will not return." Angela closed her eyes just for a second. She'd imagined this moment so many times, but the reality was gentler, less like fireworks and more like the lifting of a heavy stone. "Furthermore," Carter continued, "the court commends the defense and the federal investigation for bringing the truth to light. This case reminds us that justice requires both patience and persistence." Mitchell, seated in the second row, inclined her head at that. She didn't smile, but there was a softness in her eyes. When court adjourned, the room filled with the low hum of conversation. Tyler crossed the aisle, and for a moment Angela saw him as he had been before any of this. Just her boy, tall and a little shy, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, not caring who saw. "Let's go home," she whispered. Outside, the steps of the courthouse felt less steep than they had in weeks past. The spring air smelled faintly of cut grass and something sweet from a nearby bakery. People lingered on the sidewalk, shaking hands, clapping shoulders. The youth pastor offered to host a potluck that weekend. Someone else mentioned the high school's spring concert. Life was already tilting back toward the ordinary. As they reached the street, Carter stepped out from under the stone arch. She approached without her robe now, just a navy blazer and a simple smile. "Tyler," she said, "I hope the next time I see you, it's in a cap and gown." "Yes, ma'am," Tyler replied, his voice steady. Angela met the judge's eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Carter nodded. "You did your part. That matters." She gave a small wave and headed toward her car. The walk back to the parking lot was slow, not because they were tired, but because no one was rushing them anymore. Angela glanced at Tyler. "You know, we still have that picnic blanket in the trunk. Could be a good day for the park." Tyler shrugged, but the corner of his mouth tugged upward. "Yeah, could be." They reached the car. Angela unlocked it, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were heading towards something instead of away from it. As they drove away, the courthouse receded in the rearview mirror, its stone face catching the light. Angela thought about everything the building had held: fear, frustration, and now, finally, a measure of peace. The old gavel would rest until the next case, the next truth to be uncovered. And somewhere ahead, in the quiet promise of an ordinary afternoon, she knew they had earned a little time to just be. If you had walked past Courtroom 3B in those first days, you might have thought it was just another docket, just another young face at the defense table, just another set of charges. But inside those walls, the truth was being pulled piece by piece from where it had been hidden. And when truth finally made its way into the light, it didn't just free Tyler Freeman. It reminded everyone watching that justice, when done right, changes more than a single name on a case file. In the weeks after the dismissal, Angela found herself noticing things she'd overlooked before. Neighbors she barely knew stopped her on the sidewalk to ask how Tyler was doing. The church bulletin started carrying updates on the federal investigation. The high school principal sent a letter to parents about restoring trust. The Black community had been paying attention, not just to Tyler's case, but to the patterns Agent Mitchell had uncovered. Mitchell herself kept working, crossing state lines to follow the paper trail and the whispered instructions that had trapped too many kids. She didn't talk about open cases, but word traveled anyway. More families came forward. More inconsistencies were found. And in each story, the Black community heard an echo of its own history, both the pain of injustice and the power of standing together. Judge Carter went back to her docket, but not unchanged. Those long days had reinforced what she already knew, that the law only works if it belongs to everyone. She'd seen how quickly official language could be twisted into a shield, and how determined voices, steady, patient, and unshaken, could bend it back toward the truth. Tyler finished the school year without further trouble. He played pickup basketball at the park, helped his mom with grocery runs, and started talking about college again. At first, he didn't want to attend community meetings or forums. He said he was tired of being the kid from the case. But over time, he realized those gatherings weren't just about him. They were about making sure the next kid never had to stand where he had stood. That's the part that stayed with Angela most, the shift from survival to stewardship. She had walked into that courthouse just trying to save her son. She walked out knowing that her voice, combined with others, could help guard an entire neighborhood. And that is the lesson here, not just for the Black community, but for anyone who believes in fairness. Don't assume you know someone's story by the way they look, the street they live on, or the words someone else writes about them. Listen for the truth. Hold on to the small pieces of proof. Stand beside those who are standing up, even if it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes the most important changes don't come from the biggest offices or the loudest voices. Sometimes they come from the quiet persistence of people who refuse to let go. People who understand that justice, like a steady hand on an old gavel, can still make the right kind of noise,